They called me a deranged lunatic, a neighborhood menace suffering from some twisted hero complex, right up until the early morning hours of the 4th of July, when my supposedly obnoxious, community-ruining, $65,000 warning system ripped through the darkness and saved over 2,000 breathing, pulsing lives from a catastrophic wall of black water that by all mathematical logic should have left our little valley looking like a mass graveyard. Try to paint this image in your mind. Let it really sink into your bones. It's 3:47 in the morning. The air is thick and heavy like a wet wool blanket, and my Wheeland WPS 2910 mass notification array is shrieking across the sleepy hills of Wimberley, Texas with 130 decibels of pure, unadulterated Judgment Day terror, violently pulling half the town from their warm beds with curses on their lips and absolute venom in their hearts for the madman on the hill, while the other half, the ones who knew better, the ones who listened, were already throwing their children into their cars and driving like hell for higher ground. Barely 6 hours after that ungodly mechanical wail tore the sky open, the swelling, furious belly of the Blanco River crested its banks with the force of a detonating bomb, swallowing family sedans whole, tearing ancient oak trees up by their suffocating roots, and churning million-dollar dream homes into splintered, floating garbage in a muddy, swirling abyss. But here is the absolute, undeniable kicker of it all. Nobody died in that churning nightmare. Well, almost nobody, and it was entirely because that towering metal eyesore sitting squarely in my backyard, the one they tried to drag me to court over, gave those terrified families just enough precious, terrifying minutes to outrun the Reaper. The president of the Blanco Ridge Homeowners Association, the very woman who had spearheaded the vicious, relentless legal crusade to destroy me, found her immaculate, custom-built mansion submerged under 5 feet of toxic, muddy river water, while my modest home sat perfectly dry, high up on the limestone ridge, the siren still spinning and howling its victory song over the apocalyptic wreckage below. Which really makes you wonder, what lengths would you go to if the people you lived next to tried to criminalize the very thing designed to keep them breathing? I'm Arthur Pendleton, I'm 54 years old, and I have enough deep, jagged lines carved into my face to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that I have stood waist-deep in the kind of devastating human tragedies that most comfortable, insulated people only ever consume through the safe, glowing rectangles of their living room televisions. I spent an exhausting, soul-crushing 15 years as the state emergency management director, practically living in a state of perpetual adrenaline, dragging lifeless bodies from submerged living rooms, staring into the hollow, shell-shocked eyes of grieving mothers, and trying to find the words to explain to utterly broken families why the bureaucratic warnings came far too late to save the people they loved the most. I lost my own heart, my beautiful, brilliant wife Eleanor, during the chaotic, bungled evacuations of Hurricane Ida back in 2021, and it wasn't the surging storm surge or the crushing winds that took her from me, but the sheer, unbearable stress of being herded like cattle through 3 different, hopelessly mismanaged emergency zones in the span of 2 years because no one in charge had the spine to build a functional, proactive warning infrastructure, her fragile heart finally just giving out. In the cold, unforgiving fluorescent glare of Mercy General Hospital, surrounded by the sickening, sterile stench of industrial floor cleaner and the collective, suffocating desperation of 100 other displaced souls. Standing out on my newly built wooden deck on my very first morning in Wimberley, looking down at the breathtakingly beautiful but inherently treacherous river valley sprawling below me like a fragile, intricate model train set waiting to be kicked over by an angry god, I held a worn photograph of Eleanor tightly in my calloused hands and made a sacred, unbreakable vow to her memory that I would never, not for the rest of my miserable days, allow myself or my neighbors to be caught blind and unprepared again. I had specifically chosen this property, this exact elevation on the rocky crest overlooking the water, knowing exactly what I was going to do, spending 3 grueling days inhaling choking limestone dust and heavy diesel exhaust as contractors drilled deep into the Texas bedrock to anchor the foundation for a 40-foot steel pole, hoisting up the exact same piece of heavily weaponized auditory equipment that the federal government uses to warn cities of incoming tornadoes, a monstrous beast. That cost me $48,000 for the hardware and another $17,000 for the installation, designed specifically to vibrate the very walls of modern, heavily insulated houses and rip people from their deepest REM sleep when the sky decides to fall. Enter Valerie Sterling, the 45-year-old undisputed tyrant of the Blanco Ridge Homeowners Association, my newly appointed arch-nemesis, a woman who drove a pristine, blindingly white Range Rover with vanity plates, having recently relocated from the manicured, artificial perfection of Beverly Hills in search of what she delusionally called authentic rustic charm, which in her world essentially translated to highly curated, Instagram-ready country aesthetics completely devoid of any actual rural inconveniences like bugs, weather, or necessary survival infrastructure. Her husband, Richard Sterling, was the enormously wealthy CEO of Sterling Pinnacle Development, a massive real estate conglomerate actively paving over half the county, which honestly should have been a screaming, neon red warning sign to me from the very beginning. But I was too focused on the wiring of my system to notice the predators circling in the grass until the very day after my Siren was bolted to its mast, when Valerie marched her designer boots across my property line with all the unearned righteous indignation of a conquering general. She looked at my towering silver guardian, wrinkled her surgically perfected nose as if she had just stepped in something foul, and aggressively informed me that my installation catastrophically violated the neighborhood's strict aesthetic harmony covenants, claiming it was traumatizing the local children with its sheer, industrial ugliness. To which I calmly handed her a stack of state legal statutes highlighting that life-saving emergency systems are explicitly exempt from trivial neighborhood aesthetic whining under Texas state law, leaving her seething, her expensive, aggressively floral perfume lingering in the humid air like a toxic cloud long after she stormed back to her luxury SUV, making my morning coffee taste suddenly bitter with the realization that I was in for a war. The immediate fallout from the community was a fascinating, deeply complex psychological study in human denial, revealing the quiet, hidden fault lines running beneath the manicured lawns of our idyllic little town. Because when I ran the mandatory, manufacturer-required first test, a burst of sound that bounced off the canyon walls like the booming voice of an angry deity, the newer, wealthier transplants who made up Valerie's inner circle practically collapsed into hysterics, covering their ears and glaring at my house as if I had just declared nuclear war, while the older generation, the weathered, sun-baked locals who still carried the traumatic, waterlogged memories of the last time the river had decided to wipe the valley clean, simply stood on their porches and nodded with a grim, solemn understanding. That same evening, as the cicadas began their deafening, vibrating twilight symphony and the heavy, electric scent of impending rain hung low in the sultry Texas air, Sergeant Major Thomas Vance, a tough-as-nails Desert Storm veteran who lived 2 doors down, leaned against my fence with a cold beer and a knowing grin, telling me it was a hell of a noisemaker, but warning me that Valerie was already moving through the neighborhood like a venomous snake, knocking on doors, twisting arms, and forcing terrified people to choose sides in a conflict they didn't understand. A few days later, a sweet, frail widow named Mrs. Higgins stopped me near my mailbox, nervously wringing her pale hands as she confessed, her voice shaking with guilt, that she had been pressured into signing Valerie's aggressive petition to have my equipment dismantled, but admitting that her late husband, a man who had spent his life preparing for the worst, would have been deeply ashamed of her cowardice, especially after Valerie had arrogantly assured her that in a real emergency, they could simply call the authorities to handle it, a statement so dangerously naive it made my blood run ice cold. Down at Wimberley Supply Company, the local hardware store that smelled delightfully of sawdust and old motor oil, the owner, a good man named Jimmy, pulled me nervously behind an aisle of power tools, unable to meet my eyes as he whispered that while he fundamentally agreed with what I was doing, Valerie was viciously threatening to organize a massive, community-wide boycott of his family business if he continued to sell me the heavy-duty weatherproofing supplies I needed, forcing me to drive 30 miles out of town just to buy basic cables, while rumors began to swirl, planted carefully by Valerie's disciples, that I was a deeply unstable, grieving lunatic suffering from untreated PTSD, a ticking time bomb who was essentially terrorizing the peaceful wildlife and destroying the serene, premium property values they held more sacred than human life itself. The hostility didn't just linger in the air, it metastasized, morphing from petty, aggressive glares across the grocery store aisles into a highly orchestrated, deeply insidious campaign of suburban warfare that would have made a seasoned military tactician take notes, beginning with a brilliantly fabricated, utterly absurd environmental report claiming my Siren was single-handedly disrupting the mating patterns of local endangered migratory birds, followed swiftly by a barrage of formal, weaponized complaints filed with the county sheriff's department. Deputies would routinely show up at my gate, looking exhausted and visibly embarrassed to be there, clicking their decibel meters during my legally mandated, scheduled daytime tests, only to find the noise levels completely within the legal operational parameters for emergency broadcasting. But the sheer, crushing weight of the social isolation was beginning to take a very real, very heavy toll on my sanity. People I had shared beers with suddenly crossed the street when they saw me coming. My own family members up in Dallas received anonymous, deeply invasive phone calls, just checking on my mental stability, and the tension grew so thick, so suffocating, that some nights I would just sit out in the dark, staring at Eleanor's smiling face in that faded photograph, the crickets screaming in the brush, asking her ghost if I was actually losing my mind, if maybe I really was just a broken, grieving old man projecting my agonizing failure to save her onto a town that simply wanted to be left in peace to enjoy their scenic water views. But the data, the hard, unforgiving, terrifying meteorological data, kept pulling me back from the edge of surrender. I reached out to Dr. Eris Thorne, a brilliant, perpetually caffeinated climatologist over at Texas State University, a man who had spent 3 decades meticulously tracking the unpredictable, violent mood swings of the local river basins. And as we pored over his complex, terrifyingly jagged predictive models in a dingy diner smelling of burnt grease and old coffee, the reality of our situation hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer, realizing that our picturesque, beloved little valley had suffered catastrophic, deadly floods in 1927, again in 1970, and a devastating near-miss in 2015, meaning we weren't just overdue for a major disaster. We were mathematically staring down the barrel of a loaded atmospheric gun, and the newly constructed Blanco Ridge subdivision was built perfectly, precisely in the center of the historical kill zone. But the true, horrifying depth of the conspiracy didn't reveal itself until a rainy, miserable Tuesday evening, when a terrified, deeply conflicted junior environmental engineer named Julian Reed, a kid who worked directly for Richard Sterling's massive development firm, tracked me down in a deserted parking lot, his hands physically shaking as he slid a heavily encrypted flash drive across the dashboard of my truck, his voice breaking as he confessed that he couldn't sleep at night knowing what his bosses were hiding. When I cracked open those files in the dead of night, the sheer, breathtaking scale of the greed laid bare before me made my stomach violently churn. Sterling Pinnacle Development was actively fast-tracking a massive, 200-home expansion called Whispering Pines, intending to build right on the very lowest, most vulnerable floodplain, and they had completely, systematically buried their own internal hydrology reports that explicitly, unambiguously stated that any human beings living in that specific geographical bowl would require a massive, highly sophisticated early warning system just to survive the inevitable seasonal flash floods, the exact kind of system I had just bolted to the bedrock in my backyard. Suddenly, Valerie's frantic, manic desperation to tear down my Siren made complete, terrifying sense. It had absolutely nothing to do with neighborhood aesthetics, property values, or traumatized wildlife, and everything to do with silencing a giant, loud, unignorable mechanical monument to the very flood risk they were desperately trying to conceal from the county zoning board, a massive, multi-million-dollar real estate grift that depended entirely on maintaining the profitable illusion that the river was nothing more than a gentle, scenic amenity. I realized I wasn't just fighting a gaggle of entitled, bored suburbanites complaining about noise pollution. I was actively standing in the way of a colossal, utterly ruthless corporate machine that was perfectly, happily willing to let hundreds of unsuspecting families drown in their beds rather than spend a single dime on required environmental safety mitigation. and they had already begun purchasing local loyalty, quietly funneling generous consulting fees and charity donations to the notoriously corrupt Hayes County Commissioner Davis, greasing the political wheels to have my equipment legally condemned and removed before the brutal summer storm season could expose their deadly lie. My counteroffensive was swift, brutal, and aimed directly at the only thing these people genuinely cared about: their wallets, utilizing the explosive information hidden in the development files to quietly alert a network of regional insurance actuaries to the suppressed geological risk data, triggering a massive, overnight reevaluation of the entire community's risk profile, resulting in the residents of Blanco Ridge opening their mailboxes to find their mandatory flood insurance premiums had instantaneously tripled, an economic shockwave that shattered Valerie's coalition of neighborhood bullies almost overnight. I watched from my porch as furious, panicked neighbors engaged in screaming matches on their manicured lawns. Mrs. Higgins crying in her driveway as she realized her mortgage company was threatening to call in her loan. The fragile, superficial unity of the wealthy elite dissolving into pure, unadulterated financial panic. But even as the social tide finally began to turn in my favor, the blistering heat of June was rapidly, violently boiling the Gulf moisture into a massive, unstable atmospheric pressure cooker, and every single meteorological sensor on my array was blinking a frantic, silent warning that something huge, something catastrophically dark, was gathering just over the horizon. The final battle lines were drawn for the evening of July 3rd, a massive, highly publicized, incredibly tense emergency town hall meeting organized by Valerie and Commissioner Davis, designed as a public, humiliating execution of my project, a final, desperate gamble by the Sterling Empire to secure a legal demolition order against my Siren before the brewing skies could break open and reveal the deadly, watery truth to the world, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test every ounce of my resolve, while the universe quietly prepared to deliver the most terrifying, unignorable vindication a man could ever ask for. The air inside the Wimberley Community Center on the evening of July 3rd was thick with nervous sweat, the suffocating smell of cheap institutional floor polish, and an electric, crackling hostility that made it hard to breathe. The room packed wall to wall, with over 150 agitated residents crammed into folding chairs, news crews adjusting their bright, invasive lights, and Valerie Sterling standing at the podium looking like a triumphant queen about to watch her enemy burn. She had brought a high-priced, slick-haired attorney. She had the corrupt Commissioner Davis nodding along like a purchased bobblehead, and she clicked aggressively through a highly polished, incredibly deceptive presentation full of fabricated noise complaints and fake property depreciation charts, her voice dripping with venom as she boldly declared to the restless crowd that my paranoid, obsessive delusions were terrorizing their children and destroying the peaceful sanctity of their community, demanding an immediate, court-ordered demolition of my system. While I sat quietly in the back row, my weather tablet glowing faintly in my hands, feeling the phantom weight of Eleanor's hand on my shoulder, steadying my racing heart. When it was finally my turn to speak, I didn't yell, I didn't defend the noise, I simply stood up, the room falling into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, save for the distant, low rumble of thunder that rattled the high windows, a sound most of them had completely ignored in their eagerness to destroy me. And just as Valerie opened her mouth to spit another insult, my tablet violently vibrated, emitting the shrill, unmistakable, blood-curdling tone of an automated National Weather Service extreme emergency alert, a sound that instantly froze the blood in my veins. You have exactly 26 minutes before the Blanco River crests at a historic, unsurvivable 22 feet, I said, my voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising authority of 15 years of disaster management, projecting the terrifying red radar map onto the wall behind her stunned, suddenly pale face, watching as the smug arrogance melted into pure, unadulterated terror. And before Commissioner Davis could even slam his gavel to protest, the Wheeland WPS 29 10 array up on my hill miles away received the automated federal trigger, roaring to life with a mechanical, vibrating scream that physically shook the dust from the rafters of the community center, a sound so loud, so violently urgent, it shattered the debate, shattered the politics, and shattered the illusion of their safety in a single, deafening heartbeat. Panic exploded, chairs were kicked over, and the very people who had spent 6 agonizing months trying to drive me to the brink of insanity were suddenly weeping, grabbing their children, and sprinting for their vehicles, guided by the very noise they had fought so viciously to silence, pouring out into the night as the sky completely ripped open, dumping an apocalyptic, blinding sheet of water that instantly turned the roads into rushing, muddy rivers. The evacuation happening in chaotic but successful bursts precisely because my system gave them that golden, impossible half-hour head start. The devastation was biblical, a raging, foaming torrent of dark water that swallowed the valley whole, tearing through the river's edge haven and annihilating the half-built foundations of whispering pines, reducing million-dollar properties to splintered, floating wreckage in a matter of minutes. But as the sun rose over a deeply scarred, unrecognizable landscape, painting the muddy waters in a soft, mocking pink light, the true miracle of that deafening, obnoxious machine became undeniable. Coast Guard helicopters plucked shivering, traumatized families from their roofs. Emergency responders coordinated rescues using the backup radio network I had installed when the cell towers inevitably failed. And out of over 2,000 residents directly in the path of a flood that mathematically should have killed hundreds, we didn't lose a single, precious human life, not one, leaving Valerie Sterling, whose beautiful, pristine Range Rover was found wrapped around a bridge pylon 3 miles downstream, to sit shivering under a cheap thermal blanket, staring up at the hill where my house sat perfectly untouched, the Siren finally spinning down into silence, having undeniably saved the very people who hated it. The justice that followed was as swift and merciless as the floodwaters themselves, with the FBI swooping in before the mud was even dry, utilizing the mountain of evidence provided by Julian Reed to raid the luxurious corporate offices of Sterling Pinnacle Development, dragging Richard Sterling out in handcuffs under federal charges of environmental fraud and reckless endangerment. While Commissioner Davis resigned in disgrace, facing a massive corruption probe that shattered his political empire into dust, Valerie, ruined financially after her insurance company completely denied her massive claim because she had actively, legally fought the implementation of a required warning system in a known flood zone, quietly packed her remaining water-damaged designer bags and fled back to the shallow safety of California, leaving behind a fundamentally changed, deeply humbled community that eventually organized an annual preparedness festival, shaking my hand with tear-filled eyes, finally understanding the profound, agonizing difference between paranoid obsession and the heavy, burdensome responsibility of keeping the people you love alive. Standing on my deck months later, the valley green and recovering below, I pressed my hand against the cold steel of the Siren pole, looking up at the vast, infinite Texas sky, whispering a quiet, broken thank you to Eleanor, knowing I couldn't save her, but knowing I had finally balanced the scales, which leaves us all with a heavy, uncomfortable question to ponder in the silence of our own safe homes, when the comfortable, willful ignorance of the majority threatens the very survival of the community. Is it the moral duty of the prepared individual to become the villain in their story, just to ensure they live long enough to understand why?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.